Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins in the days of the Elder Years, when the world was still young and the light of the two trees had faded into memory. A great shadow lay over Middle-earth. It was a shadow of malice and ruin, woven from the will of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, who in his blackened halls beneath the earth schemed to make the world his own. He was not as other lords, for he was no mere king, nor even an elf of ancient years. He was one of the mighty Valar, once counted among the greatest, but who had turned to greed and cruelty and named himself master of all that dwelt beneath the sky. For long years the elves and the noble men of Beleriand had fought against his dominion, and though many were their victories, greater still was their suffering. Morgoth's hosts were endless, and his wrath unyielding. From the pits of Angband, his black fortress, he sent forth creatures of terror, orcs beyond counting, creatures bred in mockery of the firstborn, Balrogs wreathed in flame who carried whips of fire and laughed at the cries of the fallen, and above them all the dragons, terrible and cunning, whose wings darkened the skies like a storm without end. And so it was that the lords of the Eldar, the high elves who had once walked in the blessed lands of Valinor, found themselves at the end of their strength. The war against Morgoth had turned to ruin, and even the mightiest among them had fallen. Their great cities laid to waste. Gondolin, the hidden kingdom, had burned beneath the claws of dragons, and Nargothrond, the halls of Finrod Felagund, lay empty, swallowed by shadow. The last hope of the elves and men lay with one who had not yet drawn a blade in war, Eärendil the Mariner, who had sailed beyond the mortal world in search of the mercy of the Valar. Beneath the light of the evening star, he set forth from the shores of Middle-earth, his heart heavy with grief, his mind filled with longing. Upon his brow he bore a Silmaril, one of the lost jewels that had been wrought by Feanor in the long-lost days of the Eldar's glory. It was a gem of unearthly light, a fragment of the two trees, and it alone shone in the darkness of that weary age. With him sailed Elwing, his beloved, who had leapt into the sea to escape the doom that had fallen upon her people. By the grace of the Valar, she had been lifted up, borne upon the winds as a white bird, the Silmaril upon her breast. And so together they came at last to the undying lands, where no mortal foot had ever tread. Before the thrones of the Valar, Eärendil cast himself down and pleaded for the world of his kindred. "Great lords of the West," he cried, "hear now the sorrows of Middle-earth. The shadow of Morgoth stretches over all, and none may stand against him. The elves who once followed you into exile are spent, and the race of men, who were given the gift of freedom, now bow beneath the weight of chains. I have come beyond hope, beyond fear, to beg for your mercy. Will you not rise again against the darkness one last time?" For a long moment there was silence, for the Valar did not act swiftly, nor did they give their favor lightly. But Manwë, the elder king who sat upon the high throne of Arda, gazed into the heart of Eärendil and saw there the truth of his words. Then, in a voice that was like the wind over mountains, he spoke. "Long have we waited, and long have we held our hand, for the doom of the Noldor was of their own making, and we swore never to go to war for their sake again. But this matter is not theirs alone, for now the whole world suffers beneath the weight of Morgoth's tyranny. The time has come. We will rise, and we will bring ruin upon Angband." Then the Valar gathered their host, the mightiest army the world had ever seen. They called forth the Maiar, the spirits who served them in the shaping of the world, and among them came Eonwe, the herald of Manwe, whose voice alone was said to shake the heavens. And with them came the Eldar of Valinor, the elves who had never been touched by grief or time, clad in armor bright as the sun. But above all others there came the eagles, the great birds of the sky, the messengers of the west. From the peaks of Taniquetil they soared, their wings beating like the drums of war, their talons gleaming like silver spears, and at their head flew Thorondor, mightiest of all creatures of the air, whose wingspan darkened the land like a thundercloud. Then did the host of the Valar set forth upon the great sea, and the waters trembled at their passing. No wind nor wave could hinder them, for the will of the elder king was upon them. And as they came at last upon the shores of Middle-earth, the sky burned with the light of a new dawn. And so began the War of Wrath, the final battle against Morgoth, the great reckoning of the First Age. Yet even as the hosts of the West set foot upon the broken lands of Beleriand, far to the north in the shadows of Angband, the Dark Lord sat upon his iron throne. He had long watched the seas, fearing that one day the Valar would come, and now that fear had become truth. But Morgoth was not as he had been in the elder days. He had grown heavy with the weight of his own darkness, and the power that had once made him the mightiest of the Valar had become twisted and spent. He could no longer walk freely upon the world as he had in the beginning, nor did he dare to leave the black pits of his fortress. Yet he was not without his strength. His servants still obeyed, and his armies still marched at his command. He had bred new terrors in the deeps of the earth, creatures whose names had not yet been spoken beneath the sun. And though the coming of the Valar shook him, still he plotted, still he schemed. And in the darkness of his mind, he whispered a single command: "Unleash them." Deep beneath Angband, where no light had ever touched, the ground trembled. In the vast caverns of Morgoth's fortress, the shadows moved, and the air was filled with the sound of something great and terrible stirring from slumber. The war had begun. The sky above the plains of Lothland had darkened long before the sun had set. Not with the coming of night, nor with the gathering of storm clouds, but with a nameless weight that settled upon the land like a shroud woven of sorrow. The wind, once playful, had become listless, carrying only the whisper of something unseen, something waiting. The trees stood as silent sentinels, their ancient limbs half bowed beneath the invisible yoke of anticipation. Even the rivers, which had sung of old in silver tones, now trickled in hushed voices, as though fearful of breaking the heavy quiet. It was the hush before a great storm, the moment between the inhalation and the roar, when all the world seemed to pause, caught in the shadow of something vast and inescapable. And then, in the distance, there came a sound. Not the song of birds, nor the rustling of leaves, but the distant beat of drums. Slow and steady at first, like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast, then rising, growing, rolling across the land like thunder across the sea. The ground beneath the feet of elves and men trembled, a shiver that ran deep into the bones of the earth itself, as though the land had suddenly remembered fear. Upon the high hill of Amon-Ereb, Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his silver-blue cloak rippling faintly in the breath of the coming night. His gaze was fixed on the north, where the first banners of the host of the Valar could be seen glimmering upon the horizon, like the dawn breaking upon the darkness of the world. But his heart was not light, nor was it lifted in blind hope, for he knew well that war, however righteous, had never come without its price. Beside him, Elrond half-elven, young still in the reckoning of the Eldar, but bearing already the weight of wisdom beyond his years, turned his gaze toward the king, watching the quiet solemnity upon his face. There was something in Gil-galad's eyes that was unreadable, something distant, as though his thoughts wandered through ages yet to come. "The hosts of the West have come at last," Elrond murmured, his voice carrying a weight that belied his youth. "And yet you do not smile, my king. Should this not be a moment of great joy, or at least of relief? We have waited long for this day." Gil-galad did not answer at once. He let the wind pass between them, let the echoes of the distant drums settle upon the air before he turned his gaze from the horizon and regarded Elrond with something softer, something almost wistful. "Joy," he echoed at last, tasting the word as though it were foreign to him, as though he had once known its meaning but had since forgotten. "Tell me, Elrond, what is joy to a man who has seen kingdoms crumble beneath the heel of war? What is relief to one who has stood amidst the ashes of his fathers? The sun may rise, but does it erase the memory of the long night that came before it?" Elrond was silent, for he understood what Gil-galad spoke of, though he had not yet lived long enough to feel the full breadth of its weight. And yet there was something in him that resisted the sorrow in the king's voice, something that longed to reach beyond the veil of inevitability that Gil-galad seemed to see stretched before them. "But, my lord," he said at length, "is it not for this very thing that we have struggled? Is it not the purpose of all our pain, all our loss, to see this day? If war is a cruel master, then should we not at least rejoice in its final hour, in the moment when its hold upon the world is broken?" Gil-galad's lips curved, but it was not a smile of mirth. It was a thing worn out of habit, touched with the faintest ghost of sorrow. He stepped forward, letting his gaze return to the northern horizon, where the banners of the Valar's host stretched in an unbroken line. "And yet, my friend," he said, his voice quiet, his words laced with something deeper than grief, something akin to resignation, "can you tell me in truth that war ever has a final hour?" Elrond felt his breath catch at those words, for he understood then that what troubled Gil-galad was not doubt in their victory, nor fear of defeat, but the knowledge that even the greatest triumphs of war did not erase its wounds. Morgoth would fall, of this they were certain, but even the fall of a god would not unmake what had come before, nor would it wipe clean the ruin that his dominion had wrought upon the world. The land would remember, the rivers would remember, and the hearts of those who had fought, those who had lost, would carry their wounds long after the last sword had fallen. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind moved around them, whispering through the golden grass, running fingers through their hair, as though seeking to console them in its own voiceless way. Below the hill, the host of the Eldar was gathering, their banners unfurling, their armor gleaming beneath the pale light of the stars. The time of waiting was ending. The time of reckoning had come. And far to the north, beneath the weight of earth and stone, in the deepest chamber of Angband, Morgoth sat upon his throne of iron. His fingers curled against the arms of his seat. His black eyes, deep as the void itself, gazed upon the trembling vaults of his fortress, listening to the echoes that had begun to move through the world above. He felt the tremor in the earth, the shifting of the air, and he knew with a certainty that coiled in his gut like a serpent that the doom he had feared had come at last. Yet he did not rise, he did not command, nor did he summon his host. He merely sat, his face still as stone, as the voices of the deep whispered around him, carrying the sound of his own thoughts. And in that silence he exhaled long and slow, his breath like the dying wind before the coming of the storm. Then at last he spoke, and though no ear was near enough to hear, his voice moved through the shadows like a slow and creeping tide. So they have come. And beneath his feet, deep in the black halls of Angband, something stirred. The earth trembled, the air grew thick, the torches lining the walls sputtered and hissed, casting shadows that danced like living things. And in the darkness, behind the iron doors of the deepest chambers, a great breath was drawn, long and slow, like a slumbering beast waking at last from ages of restless sleep. The first dragon had risen. The night stretched endlessly over the north, a sky of deep indigo where the stars gleamed like cold embers above a world bracing for war. The land, vast and broken, lay beneath the firmament as though holding its breath, waiting for the clash of wills that would shape the course of time. The hills of Anfoglyth, once green and fair, had long since turned to dust and ruin, their bones stripped bare by the wrath of ages. And beyond them, rising black and jagged against the horizon, loomed the walls of Angband, the fortress of the Dark Lord, its towers like fingers clawing at the void above. Yet though the fortress stood strong in the bleakness of the world, it was not the same as it had once been. The weight of time had settled even upon the house of Morgoth, not in ruin, but in slow decay of another kind. The halls that had once thundered with the sound of ceaseless forging now lay shrouded in silence. The great gates, though still black and mighty, seemed less invincible than they once had, the scars of old wars lingering upon their iron surface. And within, in the deepest reaches of his throne hall, Morgoth sat, a shadow greater than any darkness, though no longer a thing of boundless strength. Long had it been since he had walked freely upon the world, for he had poured his power out, little by little, into his dominion, into the beasts and weapons of his making, into the forging of fear itself. It had been a slow and patient work, one spanning countless years, and in it he had crafted a world where his hand touched all things, from the creeping shadows of the forests to the very air that hung thick over the plains. Yet even as his will stretched far, his form had grown heavy, his body bearing the weight of the darkness he had woven into the fabric of Arda. He was no longer the being he had once been in the days of the great song, when he had stood among the Valar in majesty and might. The light of those days was lost to him, and only the hunger remained. And yet, despite all the years of conquest, despite all the suffering he had wrought, he felt something stirring in the air, something he had long foreseen and yet wished never to face. The hosts of the Valar had come, The last great war was upon him, and the hour of reckoning, long deferred, could no longer be cast aside. A low sound escaped his lips, something between a breath and a growl, a sound that carried neither fear nor rage, but something stranger, weariness, perhaps, or the heavy certainty of fate. His black eyes, deeper than the abyss, moved slowly over the chamber, taking in the vastness of his own making. The iron pillars that stretched to an unseen ceiling, the torches that flickered with flames of eerie blue. The light in them was not true fire, but something twisted and artificial, the product of his own malice. For the very light of Arda had long since abandoned this place. At the far end of the hall, the doors of iron, taller than any gate in Middle-earth, loomed in silence, their edges traced with a faint glow, runes etched into the metal as a ward against intrusion. But Morgoth knew that no wall, no gate, no fortress of stone or steel would withstand what was to come. The Valar had stirred at last, and their wrath would be like the tide of the sea washing away all that stood in its path. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his gaze downward toward the great forges that lay in the depths below. There, beneath countless tons of earth and iron, his final servants slept, the last of the great beasts, the children of his most secret labors. He had hoarded them, kept them hidden in the deeps for this very day, and now the moment had come. His hand, heavy as the weight of a mountain, lifted from the throne's armrest, and his voice, slow and low as the shifting of continents, rumbled through the chamber. Rise. Far below, in the blackest depths of Angband, the world shuddered. The air grew thick with heat, as though the breath of some long, slumbering thing had disturbed the stillness of the caverns. And then, with a sound like mountains splitting, the first of them awoke, Ancalagon. His form was darkness given flesh, his wings vast enough to eclipse the sky itself, his scales harder than any forge-wrought steel. His breath was flame, but not the flame of the mortal world. It was the fire of ruin, the fire of unmaking, a thing so terrible that the very air recoiled from it. And as his red eyes, deep as the pits of Angband, flickered open, the halls of Morgoth trembled with the knowledge of what had been unleashed. Above, upon the plains of Lothland, where the hosts of the west had begun their march, the first tremors reached them. Subtle at first, like the rolling of distant thunder, the banners of the Eldar stirred, their edges catching in the unnatural wind that seemed to rise from nowhere, carrying with it a scent foreign to this world, the scent of something vast and ancient, something that had never known the light of the sun. Gil-galad felt it before he heard it, the weight in the air, the change in the wind, the sense that the very bones of the earth had shifted beneath them. He turned his gaze toward the north, and his heart, steady though it had ever been, faltered for a moment. He did not know yet what it was, only that it was coming, and that when it arrived, it would not come alone. Beside him, Elrond, who had been silent for a time, let out a slow breath, as though he too could feel the shape of doom pressing upon the world. "My king," he murmured, his voice quiet, yet edged with something close to dread. "The war has begun." Gil-galad did not answer at once. His gaze remained fixed upon the horizon, where the stars still shone with distant, indifferent light. For a long moment he stood thus, his thoughts turned inward, his mind reaching through the long years of history, through the countless battles fought and lost, through the weight of all that had come before. Then, at last, he exhaled and turned his eyes back to his people, his warriors, his kin. "We have waited long enough," he said, his voice steady, unshaken. "The world has been given over to darkness for too long. No more. Let the last war of the First Age be begun in full." And so, beneath the cold stars, the hosts of the Valar and the Eldar of Middle-earth took up their arms, and with banners unfurled, with the wind at their backs and the weight of history upon their shoulders, they marched into the night. Far above them, upon the highest peak of Thangorodrim, where the night was thickest and the sky seemed to quiver beneath the weight of unseen wings, something vast moved in the darkness, and the first cry of the dragons rose into the air, a sound that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the making of the world. The sky, once a vast canopy of quiet stars, now trembled beneath the slow, inevitable approach of war. The host of the West moved forward beneath that sky, their banners unfurling like rivers of silver and gold, their armor glinting with the last glimmers of starlight before the dawn. But the dawn did not come. The horizon remained shrouded in a strange and unnatural gloom, a twilight born not of the turning world, but of something deeper, something older than even the grief that had shaped this land. The very air had changed, thickened with the weight of unspoken doom, as if the land itself knew what was to come and recoiled from it. Gil-galad rode at the head of the host, his silvered cloak trailing behind him like a river of light in the gloom. His face, though young in the reckoning of the firstborn, bore the weight of centuries, the quiet grief of one who has seen too much and yet must bear the burden of seeing more. The wind caught in his dark hair, pulling it back from his brow, and he turned his gaze northward to where the towers of Angband loomed like jagged teeth against the distant stars. He felt the pull of time in that moment, the slow weaving of fate that had drawn all things toward this final reckoning. Beside him, Elrond rode in silence, his own thoughts a storm of doubt and resolve. He had seen war, though not yet on this scale, and he had known sorrow, though never so vast as that which stretched before them now. He looked to his king, seeking some sign of certainty, some anchor in the shifting tides of destiny. But Gil-galad's expression remained unreadable. The High King's eyes were distant, locked upon the darkness before them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, heavy with the weight of thought. "The world trembles, and yet the stars do not fall," Gil-galad murmured, almost to himself. "It is a strange thing, is it not, that we stand on the brink of ruin, and yet the heavens remain unchanged. The stars shone when we first awoke in Cuiviénen, and they shine still, as if unmoved by the tides of our grief, untouched by the fire and shadow that has burned this world." Elrond considered his words for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps it is because they do not belong to us," he said at last. "They were set before our time, before even the days of the trees. They are older than our wars, older than our sorrow. They have seen the making of the world, and they will see its unmaking, and yet they will remain. Perhaps that is their wisdom, to watch and not to grieve." Gil-galad turned to him then, a flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps sadness passing through his gaze. "Is that what you believe? That wisdom is the absence of grief?" Elrond hesitated. He had not meant it so, but now hearing the words from another's lips, he felt their coldness. He frowned, searching for something deeper in himself, something truer. "No," he said finally, his voice softer, more uncertain. "I do not believe that. But I wonder, if the stars do not grieve, does that make them wise, or only distant?" Gil-galad did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted back toward the north, toward the looming weight of Angband, where the darkness seemed to pulse like a living thing. "Perhaps," he said at last, "wisdom is not to grieve less, but to grieve well." Elrond turned those words over in his mind, weighing them, testing their shape against his own heart. To grieve well. It was a strange thought, and yet it settled within him like a stone cast into deep water, sinking down into places he had not thought to examine before. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was filled with thought, with meaning unspoken, with the quiet understanding of two souls standing upon the edge of something vast and unknowable. The wind moved between them, carrying with it the scent of cold stone and distant fire, the echoes of a world preparing for its own undoing. And then, from the north, there came a sound. A low, shuddering tremor, felt first in the bones, in the marrow of the earth itself, before it rose into the air, into the sky. It was not the sound of wind, nor water, nor even the drums of war. It was the sound of something waking. Far beneath the blackened peaks of Thangorodrim, in the deep places of Angband, the great vaults of the world shuddered, and fire licked at the darkness. Ancalagon, mightiest of Morgoth's creations, stirred in his prison of stone, his vast wings shifting, his talons curling against the bedrock. He had slept long, too long, dreaming only of fire and ruin, waiting for the call of his master. And now, at last, that call had come. His red eyes flared open, casting a terrible light into the gloom, and with a single shattering cry, he rose. Above, the sky trembled. The air turned thick, heavy, pressing down upon the world like the weight of an unseen hand. And in that moment, Gil-galad knew the war had truly begun. He turned to Elrond, his voice low but steady. "We march," he said, "not for victory, not for glory. We march because we must, because the world cannot bear this shadow any longer." And so, with the banners of the Valar at their backs, with the wind at their heels and the weight of ages upon their shoulders, the host of the West moved forward toward the darkness, toward the fire, toward the last great war of the First Age. And far above them, in the highest vaults of the sky, the stars watched, silent and unchanged. The wind that swept across the plains of Anfoglyth carried with it the echoes of forgotten wars, a cold breath from the past that stirred the dust of long-dead battles. The bones of fallen warriors lay hidden beneath that gray expanse, swallowed by time, yet never truly gone, for the land remembered. It had soaked up the blood of elves and men, of orcs and monsters alike, and though the years had worn away their shapes, their presence lingered in the silence. The ground was firm but brittle beneath the feet of the marching host, as though it feared to bear the weight of another war, as though it knew that soon the sky above would be torn by fire and shadow once more. Gil-galad rode at the head of the army, his spear Aeglos gleaming cold as frost even beneath the muted light of the stars. His face, though calm, was troubled, his thoughts a tide that pulled him between past and present, between memory and the vast uncertainty of what was to come. He could feel the breath of doom upon the air, a presence unseen yet undeniable, a weight pressing upon his chest, slowing the beating of his heart. War had always carried this heaviness, this knowledge that even in victory there would be no true triumph, only survival. And yet he had no choice but to march forward, to lead his people into the storm, knowing that some among them would never return. Beside him, Elrond rode in silence, his gray eyes cast toward the northern horizon, where the first fires of Angband flickered like distant embers, a promise of the wrath that awaited them. He could feel it deep in his bones, the trembling of the world itself as something vast and ancient stirred in the depths of Morgoth's fortress. He had heard tales spoken in hushed voices by those who had witnessed the horror of Glaurung, the first of the dragons who had burned cities to cinders and broken the spirits of men with nothing more than his gaze. But this was something greater. This was not merely a beast of war, but a storm given flesh, a shadow that would blot out the stars. Ancalagon had awakened. For a long time, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them stretched, filled only by the rhythm of hooves upon the earth, by the distant clang of armor, by the murmurs of soldiers preparing themselves for the battle to come. But at last, Elrond turned to Gil-galad, his voice low, thoughtful. "Tell me, my king," he murmured, "do you ever wonder if the world will remember us when we are gone? If it will recall this war, this struggle, not as the ending of an age, but as something more? Or will we be reduced to echoes, our names carved into stone, and forgotten by all but the dust?" Gil-galad did not answer at once. He let the wind pass between them, let the weight of the question settle into the marrow of his thoughts before he turned his gaze to Elrond, his eyes unreadable, filled with the depth of something vast and unspoken. "The world does not remember us as we wish to be remembered," he said at last, his voice quiet, edged with something that might have been sorrow. "It remembers what it chooses, and often it does not remember at all. There were kings before me, warriors and lords, whose names were once spoken with reverence, and now they are little more than whispers in the halls of forgotten ruins. Even the stars, which have watched over all the ages of this world, do not weep for the fallen. They shine as they have always shone, indifferent to the tides of history." Elrond frowned, his hands tightening upon the reins of his horse. "Then what is the purpose of all this? If we are to be forgotten, if the songs of our deeds will fade into silence, why do we fight? Why do we bleed for lands that may not remember us? For people who may one day turn their faces from the past and call it legend?" There was no bitterness in his words, only a quiet despair, the kind that gnawed at the soul in the long hours of the night when the weight of mortality pressed down upon the heart. Gil-galad sighed, his gaze turning back toward the north, toward the darkened sky where the first movements of dragons could be glimpsed, great shadows shifting against the night. "Because," he said softly, "our purpose is not to be remembered. It is to do what must be done. Whether history records our names or not, we do not fight for songs, Elrond. We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. We fight so that there might be another dawn, another chance for this world to heal, even if we are not there to see it." He paused, his eyes darkening. "Do you not think that the Edain fought thus long ago, when they marched against Morgoth in the days of Hador and Beren? Did they not fight knowing that their names would be lost in the turning of the years? And yet, had they not stood, had they not given their lives, we would not be here now. Elrond was silent, turning the words over in his mind, weighing their truth against the part of himself that longed for something more than duty, something beyond mere necessity. But as he looked upon the vast host before them, as he beheld the banners of the Valar, the unbreakable line of the Eldar, the determined faces of men who had left their homes behind to stand against the darkness, he knew that Gil-galad spoke truly. To seek remembrance was to seek the wind, to grasp at something that would slip through the fingers no matter how tightly one held on. But to stand, to fight, to endure, this was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that had ever mattered. And so, with the last vestiges of doubt fading from his heart, he turned his gaze forward once more to the storm that awaited them, to the fire and shadow that would soon engulf the world. And as the first tremors of battle began to shake the earth, as the roar of Ancalagon split the heavens and the sky above them turned to flame, he whispered almost to himself, "Then let us make a stand worth forgetting." And with that, the war began in earnest. The sky was torn asunder. The firmament, once dark and still, now trembled beneath the weight of a fury not seen since the world was young. Fire and shadow warred for dominion in the heavens. Vast wings beat against the wind, sending torrents of hot air rolling across the desolate plains. The ground itself trembled as though recoiling from what had been unleashed, as though the very bones of the world groaned under the weight of the storm. And there, standing upon the blackened fields of Anfoglyth, between the ruined lands and the last hope of the free peoples, the host of the Valar met the darkness at last. Gil-galad stood at the forefront, his spear Aeglos gleaming even amidst the smoke and flame, its frost-white tip a stark defiance against the heat that surged toward them. His heart was steady, though the weight of doom pressed upon him, an unseen hand upon his soul, a cold certainty that whispered of the cost yet to be paid. He turned his gaze upward, where the shadow of Ancalagon, the greatest of Morgoth's winged terrors, blotted out the sky itself. His wings were like veils of blackness, his form of vastness beyond comprehension, and when he roared, it was as though the air itself split apart, the cry of something that should not exist in any world still touched by light. Elrond, standing at the king's side, felt the sound reverberate through his bones, deep and terrible, a force not merely heard, but felt, as if it sought to unravel all that stood before it. His fingers tightened upon the hilt of his sword, and for a moment doubt whispered at the edges of his mind. How could such a thing be fought? How could mortal hands, even those of the Eldar, even those who had seen the light of Aman, hope to stand against something so vast, so ancient, so filled with the power of ruin itself? He had read of dragons in the old scrolls, had listened to tales of Glaurung, of the devastation left in his wake, of kingdoms laid low by fire. But Ancalagon was something else entirely. Glaurung had been a beast of cunning and malice, but this was the pinnacle of Morgoth's making, the final horror unleashed from the pits of Angband. He turned to Gil-galad, searching for certainty in the king's face, and found not fear, but something deeper, something more solemn. Gil-galad was not untouched by the terror that loomed above them, nor was he blind to the madness of what lay ahead. But he did not falter. and when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, as though untouched by the storm that raged around them. "Elrond," he murmured, his gaze still fixed upon the darkness above. "Have you ever considered what it means to stand against ruin?" Elrond hesitated, caught off guard by the question, and for a moment he did not answer. The words lingered between them, quiet yet heavy, carrying a weight beyond the mere contemplation of war. At last he spoke, though his voice was uncertain. "To stand against ruin is to fight against that which cannot be undone. It is to resist the tide, knowing that it will always rise again." His brow furrowed, and he looked to Gil-galad, searching for meaning in the king's expression. "Is that what we do now? Do we fight only to delay the inevitable?" Gil-galad's gaze softened, and he exhaled, his breath barely audible beneath the cacophony of the gathering storm. "It is an easy thing," he said slowly, "to look upon the vastness of shadow and believe that it is unending, to see the great darkness of Morgoth and think that it will rise again and again, as all things do in the turning of the world. But tell me, Elrond, does the rising tide make the mountain less real? Does the wave undo the stone simply because it crashes upon it?" Elrond frowned, considering the words, and Gil-galad continued. "To stand against ruin is not to believe that it can be undone. It is to stand because it is right. To stand because there is a choice in every moment, to yield to the tide or to be the rock upon which it breaks. History does not remember those who surrendered to despair, but it does remember those who surrendered to despair, but it does remember those who stood, even when the storm was at its worst." Elrond inhaled slowly, feeling the words settle within him, feeling them find root in the deeper places of his heart. There was truth in them, truth that had always been there, though he had not named it before. They fought not for an ending, not for some perfect resolution where darkness would never rise again. They fought because there was no other choice, because to surrender to fear, to accept that doom was inevitable, was to be complicit in its coming. And so long as there were those willing to stand, willing to lift their swords, willing to resist, then the darkness could never truly claim the world. He lifted his gaze, and in the distance, the first clash of steel rang out as the vanguard met the enemy. The war had begun in earnest. Dragons wheeled in the sky, their fiery breath turning the night to day in flashes of terrible brilliance. Balrogs, wreathed in shadow and flame, surged forward, their great whips lashing against the defenders, felling even the mightiest among them. The land was set ablaze, the very air thick with the scent of ash and blood. And yet the host of the Valar did not yield. Gil-galad raised his spear, and the banners of the Eldar lifted in answer. "Then let us be the mountain," he murmured. And with that, he led the charge into the fire. Descended from the heights of the sky. Descended from the heights of the sky. Their vast wings beating against the darkness, their talons raking against the scales of dragons beneath them. The elves fought with the fury of those who had known loss beyond measure, their blades flashing in the firelit gloom, their voices rising in songs of defiance, even as they fell. The earth trembled beneath their feet, torn by the force of the conflict. And in the depths of Angband, Morgoth, the first and mightiest of all evil, sat upon his throne, listening to the sound of his empire unraveling. And far above, where the sky was no longer black, but red with flame, Eärendil the Mariner sailed his ship through the heavens, the light of the Silmaril upon his brow, shining brighter than the burning world below. The time had come, Ancalagon had risen, and now he would fall. The heavens had never borne witness to a battle such as this, where once the stars had gleamed cold and distant, detached from the sorrows of Middle-earth. Now they watched as the sky itself was torn apart. Clouds of blackened smoke, thick as the weight of ages, rolled like sentient things across the firmament, choking the light of the Valar's banners below, blotting out the sight of the earth beneath them. And in that sky, where no mortal thing had ever dared to soar, fire and ruin clashed in a war that belonged to the realm of legends. Eärendil sailed above the world, his ship Vingilot, a vessel of starlight made manifest in silvered hull, gleaming even in the thickest darkness. The wind did not guide him, nor did the stars. He was driven only by the fire in his heart, by the knowledge that upon this night, upon this battle, the fate of all things would be decided. The Silmaril upon his brow burned with a radiance beyond the light of the sun or the glow of the moon, a beacon that outshone the flames of Angband that stood against the black fire of Morgoth's last defiance. And before him, rising like a storm that sought to devour the sky itself, loomed Ancalagon the Black. There were no words to capture the sheer immensity of the beast. He was no simple dragon, no mere creature of flame and malice. He was the greatest of all that Morgoth had wrought, the pinnacle of the Dark Lord's hatred given shape and will. His wings stretched wide, blacker than the void from whence Morgoth had come, so vast that they cast shadows even in the smoke-choked air. And his scales glistened not with the sheen of living flesh, but with the dull, malevolent luster of a world consumed in fire. His breath was no mere flame, but a storm of annihilation, a wave of destruction that could sunder mountains, that could set the very winds ablaze. And when he roared, the heavens themselves trembled, the stars shivering in their ancient places as if recoiling from the presence of something that should never have been. Eärendil did not flinch, though the weight of the dragon's malice pressed against him, though he felt the very air thickening as if Ancalagon's will alone sought to turn the sky into his dominion. He held the tiller of Vingilot with steady hands, his grip firm, not from arrogance, nor from the reckless bravado of a warrior seeking glory, but from the simple truth that there was no turning back. The war below raged on, the host of the Valar clashing against the final horrors of Morgoth's dominion. But he knew that the true battle was here, above the burning world. If Ancalagon was not brought down, then all that was fought for would be for nothing. The dragon's voice rolled across the sky like the breaking of the world. "Mortal, you come before me with the light of the Eldar upon your brow, with the arrogance of the West in your bones, thinking yourself my doom. But you are nothing. You are a breath in the wind, a flicker of life that will be devoured by the dark. You are but a shadow against the fire." His voice was deeper than thunder, filled with the weight of ages, the voice of a being who had never known doubt, never known fear. Eärendil did not answer at once. He merely watched, his breath steady, his mind calm, though his heart was filled with the echoes of all that had come before. He thought of Elwing, his beloved, who had cast herself into the sea to save the Silmaril. He thought of the scattered remnants of his kin, those who still clung to hope in the ruins of their fallen homes. He thought of the Edain, of the blood of men who had suffered long under the yoke of shadow. And he thought of the Valar, of their judgment upon the world, of the choice they had given him, to stand here now, alone against the might of Morgoth's last creation. And then he spoke. "You are vast, Ancalagon. You are mighty beyond the reckoning of any creature upon this world. But for all your greatness, you are bound to the will of another. You are not free. You are not your own." His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the sky, clear and unwavering. "You call me a shadow against the fire, and perhaps that is so. But even a shadow may stretch across the flame if the light behind it is bright enough. And this light—" He touched the Silmaril upon his brow, and in that instant its radiance flared, illuminating the sky as though the sun itself had risen within the heart of the battle. "Is greater than any darkness you have ever known." Ancalagon shrieked, recoiling as the light struck him, his wings flailing against the air, his massive form twisting in agony. For a moment, the night was turned to day, and below, upon the plains where the host of the Valar fought still, warriors turned their eyes upward, their battle momentarily forgotten as they beheld the sight above them. Two figures, one vast, one small, locked in combat beyond the reach of mortals. Then the dragon roared, and his fury became a storm. With a single beat of his wings, he surged forward, his maw opening wide, and from his throat came a torrent of flame, a fire blacker than the void, a fire that consumed all in its path. Vingilot tilted, narrowly escaping the inferno, but the heat seared through the silvered hull, and Eärendil felt its wrath even through the protection of the Valar. He clenched his teeth, gripping the tiller tightly, knowing that there could be no retreat. This was no battle of swords, nor of simple might. This was a war of will, a contest of forces beyond flesh and steel. It was light against dark, defiance against dominion, the last gasp of hope against the vast and endless hunger of ruin. And so they clashed. Vingilot wheeled and dived, its silver light carving through the darkness, while Ancalagon raged, his vast bulk moving with a speed that belied his size, his great tail lashing against the heavens, sending shock waves through the very fabric of the air. Fire met light, shadow met flame, and each strike shook the sky as though the world itself could not bear the battle. The stars flickered, the winds howled, and below, the war upon the land reached its crescendo as the Valar's host pressed forward, breaking the last defenses of Angband. While Morgoth, seated upon his throne, listened to the sky above and knew at last. Eärendil felt the pull of fate, the weight of history pressing upon him. And in that moment, he understood that this was more than a battle. This was the breaking of an age, the ending of a song that had played since the first days of the world. And he knew, too, that there could only be one ending. As Ancalagon dove once more, fire bursting from his maw, Eärendil did not turn away. He raised the Silmaril high, and its light poured forth like a river of pure flame, meeting the dragon's wrath in a collision of forces that sent a shockwave rolling through the sky. And then, with all the strength he had left, with all the will of those who had come before, he drove Vingilot forward, his blade flashing, his spirit unbroken. And with a sound that shook the heavens, Ancalagon the Black fell. For a moment, time itself seemed to shatter. The sky, which had been a battlefield of fire and light, stood frozen, as if the very heavens recoiled from what had just transpired. Then, with the force of a world breaking, Ancalagon fell. The vast shadow that had loomed over Middle-earth, the terror that had stretched its wings across the firmament like a black sun, was cast down from the heights. And as he descended, his ruin became a spectacle of devastation beyond reckoning. His great body, larger than the peaks of Thangorodrim themselves, twisted and writhed in the agony of his fall, his vast wings burning as they tore through the air, scattering storms of embers like the dying breath of a god. The wind howled in protest, the clouds breaking apart as the beast plummeted. And below, the warriors of both light and darkness turned their eyes upward, their battles forgotten, as the living mountain of shadow hurtled toward the earth. The impact came like the unmaking of the world. The peaks of Thangorodrim, the blackened towers of Morgoth's dominion, the mountain strongholds that had loomed over Angband since the First Age had begun, shattered beneath the weight of the beast's body. A sound rose from the depths of the ruined fortress, not merely the breaking of stone, but something deeper, something older, the wail of a kingdom undone, the last cry of a power that had endured for ages, but could endure no longer. The very bones of the land cracked beneath the force, and for miles around the earth trembled as though caught in the grip of an earthquake sent to end all things. Smoke and dust surged skyward in a tidal wave of ruin, blotting out the stars, turning the battlefield into a realm of choking darkness. And in that silence that followed the fall, in that brief pause where all forces of war stood witness to the end of Morgoth's mightiest servant, Eärendil hovered above the wreckage, his ship Vingilot wreathed in light, his breath coming in slow, steady gasps. His hands ached from the force of the battle, his limbs felt leaden, his mind clouded by exhaustion. But he had done it. The mariner, born of both men and elves, had slain the greatest dragon to have ever darkened the sky. He let his head tilt back, his gaze turning toward the Silmaril upon his brow, its light unfading, unbroken, as though it had not even been touched by the battle, as though its radiance remained untarnished by the smoke and the flame. He thought then of Elwing, of her voice in the quiet of the night, of the way she had once traced her fingers over the maps he had drawn of the seas, of the hope that had shone in her eyes even when all hope seemed lost. He had fought for her, for their children, for those who'd never taken up a sword but who had suffered beneath the weight of war nonetheless. He had fought because there had never been another choice. Far below, the battlefield still burned, though the tide had turned. The forces of the Valar pressed forward, sweeping through the last remnants of Morgoth's armies, their banners gleaming like the rising dawn in the darkness of war. The Balrogs, once feared as the greatest of Morgoth's captains, were driven back, their fires dimming beneath the relentless advance of the Maiar. And the orcs, who had once numbered beyond counting, now fled in disarray, their will broken with the fall of their mightiest lords. It was an ending written in fire and blood, but it was an ending nonetheless. Gil-galad stood amidst the ranks of the Noldor, his spear Aeglos planted into the ground beside him, his gaze locked upon the distant ruin of Angband. He had seen many things in his years as king, had witnessed the fall of his kindred, the slow breaking of his people's dominion in Middle-earth. He had known loss beyond words, had walked the battlefields of Beleriand, and seen the corpses of friends and foes alike left to the slow work of time. But never had he witnessed something like this. The destruction of a fortress that had stood longer than any city, the sundering of mountains that had once seemed immutable, the death of a power that had shaped the very course of history itself. And yet, for all its magnitude, for all the grandeur of the fall, he did not smile. Victory had come, but at what cost? How many lives had been offered upon the altar of this war? How many souls had been torn from the world to bring about this moment? Elrond, standing beside him, exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword. His mind was a storm of emotions, of thoughts that struggled to find their shape amidst the chaos. He had fought in this war with all the strength of his lineage, with all the might of the blood that ran through his veins, yet he could not shake the hollow ache in his chest. "It is over," he said at last, though his voice did not carry the relief he had expected. The words felt strange upon his tongue, as if they did not yet belong to the world, as if they were too soon spoken. Gil-galad did not turn to him. His gaze remained upon the ruined stronghold, upon the broken gates of Angband, where the last echoes of Morgoth's reign were being silenced. "No," he murmured, and his voice was quiet, almost distant. "Not yet." Elrond frowned, following his king's gaze toward the shattered stronghold. "What more is there? Morgoth's armies are scattered. His great beasts are slain. His captains are fallen. There is no power left to fight." But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his thoughts. He knew better than most that evil did not die so easily, that darkness had roots deeper than the earth itself. Gil-galad turned at last, and in his eyes was something Elrond had never seen before, a sorrow so deep, so unfathomable, that it seemed to stretch beyond the present moment, beyond this war, beyond this age itself. "The armies were never the true power of Morgoth," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge that had long been buried in the hearts of the wise. "Nor were the dragons, nor the Balrogs, nor the vast dominions he carved into the bones of the world. His power was something far more insidious, something that no blade can cut, no fire can burn." He exhaled slowly, his gaze turning back to the ruin. Morgoth was the first to pour himself into the world, to weave his will into the very fabric of Arda. Even with his defeat, even with his throne cast down and his armies broken, his shadow lingers. His evil lingers. It is not something that can be undone in a single war. Elrond was silent, his mind tracing the implications of those words. He had always believed that war had an end, that even the darkest of shadows could be erased with enough light. But now, standing upon this battlefield, looking upon the ruin of the greatest of all evils, he wondered if that had ever truly been the case. Morgoth would be taken, cast into the void, banished beyond the circles of the world, and yet his mark upon Arda would remain. the wounds he had carved into the earth, into the hearts of all who had suffered beneath him, would not fade simply because his throne was no more. And so, as the last battle of the War of Wrath came to its close, as the dust settled upon a world forever changed, a thought lingered in Elrond's mind, one that he dared not speak aloud, though it settled into the depths of his soul like a seed waiting for the right moment to grow. If Morgoth had been the first, then surely there would be another. The world was quiet, not the silence of peace, nor the gentle stillness of mourning, but a hush wrought from exhaustion, from the aftermath of something too vast to be fully comprehended. The land itself seemed to exhale, weary after bearing witness to the clash of titanic wills, to the sundering of mountains and the breaking of kingdoms. Smoke coiled from the ruins of Angband, twisting upward in the last defiant echoes of a dominion that had once darkened all of Middle-earth. The sky, though no longer torn by fire, remained bruised and wounded, thick clouds rolling across the heavens as if uncertain whether the storm had truly passed. The air was heavy with the scent of ash and charred earth, a bitter reminder that even in victory there had been loss beyond measure. Among the ruins, the host of the Valar moved like shadows against the smoldering landscape, their banners tattered but still held aloft, their armor dulled with soot and blood. Warriors weary beyond words stood upon the broken plains, their swords hanging loosely in their hands, their bodies too drained to yet comprehend what had passed. The Great War was over, the last battle fought, and yet a question hung in the air, unspoken yet felt by all. What now? What did one do when the enemy they had fought for centuries was finally cast down? How did one rebuild after such devastation, after the very world itself had been reshaped by wrath? Gil-galad stood at the precipice of the ruins, his spear planted firmly into the scorched earth, his gaze distant as he looked toward what remained of Morgoth's stronghold. The once impenetrable fortress had become a great cave, its towers sundered, its gates thrown open like the ribs of a carcass picked clean by time and war. He should have felt triumph, the righteous satisfaction of a victory won through great sacrifice, but all he felt was the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders. His people had fought and bled for this moment, and now that it was here, it felt as insubstantial as mist slipping between his fingers the moment he tried to grasp it. Elrond approached, his footsteps slow, careful, as if he feared breaking whatever fragile thing still remained in the air between them. His face, though young by the reckoning of the Eldar, bore the weight of what he had seen, and in his gray eyes lay a depth of sorrow that could not be undone. For a time he did not speak, only standing beside his king, letting the wind pass between them, stirring the tattered remnants of their cloaks. Then at last he murmured, "We have done it. The war is ended." Gil-galad did not move, did not turn to look at him, but Elrond could sense the thoughts turning in his mind, the slow unraveling of what had just passed. When the High King spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, yet touched with something deep, something like grief, though not quite the same. "Is it?" he asked, his eyes still fixed upon the distant horizon, where the last remnants of Morgoth's shadows seemed to dissipate into the coming dawn. Wars end when swords are sheathed, when kings kneel, when treaties are signed. But this war was not one of crowns or borders, Elrond. It was not a thing of men and their feuds, nor of land to be claimed. This war was the breaking of something older, deeper, and I wonder, can such a thing ever truly be ended? Elrond furrowed his brow, his grip tightening upon the hilt of his sword. He wanted to believe that there was an answer to that question, something firm, something that would grant meaning to the devastation they had just endured. But as he looked upon the ruins before them, upon the remnants of Morgoth's dominion, he realized that he was uncertain. "We have cast Morgoth down," he said at last, his voice quieter now, as if voicing the words made them somehow less real. "He will be taken beyond the world, beyond the reach of time itself. If he was the root of all darkness, then surely with him gone, the world will begin to heal." Gil-galad turned to him then, his expression unreadable, his silver eyes filled with something that Elrond could not quite name. "Do you believe that darkness can be destroyed, Elrond?" he asked. And though his tone was not unkind, there was something ancient in it, something weary. "That if you cast a shadow into the void, it will never return? That if you slay a beast, there will never be another?" Elrond hesitated. He had always believed in victory, in the idea that evil, once defeated, could be undone, that light could be restored to the places it had once abandoned. But now, standing here amidst the wreckage of a world that had been scarred beyond recognition, he felt the uncertainty creeping into his heart. He thought of the stories he had heard of the first rising of Morgoth, of how he had once been counted among the Valar before his fall. He thought of how long they had fought, how many had perished in the struggle against him. And yet, for all their efforts, even with his defeat, the shadow had never truly left the world. And now, though Morgoth himself was defeated, the scars he had left behind would never fully fade. "I don't know," he admitted, and the words felt heavy upon his tongue. "I once believed that victory meant an end to suffering, that once the enemy was vanquished, the world would know peace. But now I wonder, is peace ever truly won, or is it only borrowed, a fleeting moment before the cycle begins again?" Gil-galad nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he had expected. "The shadow lingers even after the fire has been extinguished," he murmured, his gaze turning back to the ruins, his expression thoughtful. "Morgoth is gone, yes, but his will, his influence, his malice, it has seeped into the very bones of the world. It will take root in other hearts, in other hands. The wars of our fathers have ended, Elrond, but I fear that others will rise. Perhaps not in our time, perhaps not even in the time of our children, but one day another will seek dominion, another will twist the world to his will, and all this will come again." Elrond inhaled deeply, his fingers curling against his palm. He knew it was true. He had felt it even as the battle had ended, a whisper in the wind, a lingering presence that did not fade even as Morgoth was undone. The world had changed, but its wounds remained, and wounds, if left untended, festered. He did not know what the years ahead would bring, nor what new shadows might one day rise, but he understood now that their struggle had not been for an ending, but for a reprieve. And perhaps that was enough. The wind stirred, carrying with it the first light of morning, the dawn breaking over the horizon, casting golden fire across the wreckage of the battlefield. It was not an untainted light, for the smoke still clung to the air, the scent of ruin still lingered, but it was light nonetheless. And as the first rays of the sun touched the banners of the west, Elrond felt a quiet resolve settle within him. "We cannot see the end," he said at last, his voice steadier now. "But we can stand for the present. We can ensure that when the shadow rises again, there will still be those who remember what it means to fight. There will still be those who choose light." Gil-galad looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time that morning, he allowed the ghost of a smile to touch his lips. "Yes," he murmured, "and so long as there are those who choose the light, the darkness will never hold dominion." And so, as the sun rose upon a world forever changed, the High King and his herald stood upon the edge of history, gazing into the future that none could yet see. And though they did not know what lay ahead, they knew this: so long as there was breath in their bodies, so long as there was still hope in the hearts of those who walked beneath the sky, the war against the darkness would never truly be lost.